welcome. My name is Brittany Peterson, and I look forward to spending some time with you today talking about culture and criminal justice, biases, stereotyping, and even some different scenarios so we can really expand on our understanding of what that means to us in our profession. I am currently a court clerk. I work with all ranges of life and people, from judges to lawyers to defendants to victim advocates. Our communication with one another is imperative to make sure that everybody is treated equally, that everybody is seen to in a timely manner, as well as making sure that our court runs smooth and that we achieve clear, concise communication amongst our community. I'd like to start by discussing what culture is in criminal justice. Culture helps shape how we think and what we believe. And given the importance of culture in our lives, it really impacts our biases and the way that we communicate. I mean, it's as simple as a difference between a resident of the North that would call it a pop, and a resident of the South. You run into Texas and you're buying a soda or a Coke. Everywhere that we go, people have different forms of communication. I'd like to talk a little bit more now about some of the types of issues that we run into that can impact our communication styles. One being race versus ethnicity. So when you talk about race is described more as a physical attribute. So how someone physically appears. Do they have curly hair? Do they have darker skin? Do they have almond-shaped eyes? Are they tall? There's so many things that go into race and how we classify people into each category. And then you have ethnicity. And when you're thinking about ethnicity, you're thinking more about the culture of the people and a geographic location. So a really good example is like when you think of Spain, you think of flamingo dancing and bullfighting and maracas. So there's definitely a lot of unique features that go into different ethnicities. And then that brings us into prejudice, and that's more of a belief as well. And so it's a biased belief or attitude towards something. So for example, you might be thinking, my friend Jane, she's a hoot, but she's in her 90s. So I don't really think we should bring her on vacation. She's getting kind of slow. And that's an age prejudice. Discrimination is an action against a group of people based on those beliefs. But in fact, Jane's probably 90 and still practicing gymnastics, like this lady. I would take her on vacation. She seems like a great time. So leaning more back into the criminal justice sides of things, there's often miscommunication that leads to bad decisions. And unfortunately, recently, we have had an incident that I think screams volumes about this in particular concept. Some of you may have heard about the unfortunate incident that happened with Sonia Massey in Springfield, Illinois in the past months. And this comes down to a misunderstanding based on a belief system. To sum it up, Sonia was asked to tend to a pot of boiling water by a sheriff's deputy, and when he expressed some uneasiness with the situation, she said, I rebuke you in the name of Jesus, which is a blessing. And unfortunately, that deputy saw it as a threat, and he acted in a manner that unfortunately cost Sonia's life. And so when we're talking about different kinds of speaking, it can be an accent, it could be slang terms, and it goes back to our cultures, goes back to our belief systems. And unfortunately, without clear, concise communication, errors do happen. The second example I would like to talk to you about is a misunderstanding because we fail to listen. And listening is so much more than just using our ears. We have to think about things like nonverbal cues, distractions during our conversation, or prejudging the speaker. When you think about the last example there, a good term that comes to mind is the ethnocentrism. And what that describes is the tendency to evaluate other cultures in terms of our own. So a belief that our culture is superior, that we might be superior because of the way we dress, or someone is inferior because of the way they dress. We might be superior because our belief is Christianity, or our belief is Judaism. It leads us on to stereotyping. So stereotyping can negatively influence decision making. And there's a lot of different things that someone can be stereotyped on, whether it be their race or their ethnicity, their language ability, their citizenship, or their religion. And when you actually think about the history of stereotyping itself, it actually originates back to the 18th century. And a stereotype was a simple printing device. It was just that. Simple. It was a printing plate. It later evolved to describe an oversimplified opinion, a prejudiced attitude, a stereotypical bias. And I think a big one that's been happening long before you and I is gender. So think about gender, and it goes back to early kings and queens. Often we wanted a male heir because only men could rule, and women were to be, the homemakers, and they were to stay home, and they would cook, and they would sew. And now our society now tells us that those stereotypical roles no longer apply. There's many men that are the homemakers and women that are CEOs. So as we evolve, so do, our roles in our society. Anyways, we could go on about that forever. But, so yes, stereotyping just started out as a printing plate. Next, I would like to cover the relationship between ethnocentrism and the communication issues among criminal justice professionals and the public. For example, if you see somebody who has a different race than you, it might make you feel uncomfortable. You might feel that they're dangerous, and that might make you act out in a way that you normally wouldn't. Or an ethnicity. We discussed a little bit about ethnicity at the very beginning of the video. language ability, whether it's somebody who uses sign language, whether it's someone who speaks a different language. Obviously, not being able to effectively communicate with one another can cause all sorts of miscommunications. And then you have citizenship and the stereotype that comes along with that about being here in America, but not being a citizen. What are you contributing? A lot of people would say. Religion. There's so many stereotypes that go along with this. About terrorists. For a long time, that was a stereotype that came with certain religions. Stereotyping socioeconomic status. Someone lives in an impoverished area, they're lazy, they're addicts, and we know that that's not the case. Someone's gender, and there's a lot in this generation, a lot of new things that we have to learn and we have to evolve to. Gender, whether you're transgender, non-binary, we talk about pronouns now. So there's stereotypes that come along with that. There's stereotypes with being in a homosexual relationship. There's stereotypes about age. We talked about Jane earlier. Jane's 90 and she still does gymnastics. She still walks 2 miles a day. And she still bakes the best pies with the homemade crust. Jane is not slow. Jane is not smelly. Or if you want to stereotype someone who's young, they're inexperienced. They're still young. They're not smart about certain situations. Disabilities. It could be a mental disability. Oh, they're crazy. Or look at them. They're high. They can barely stand up. Or, oh, they're so lazy. There's so much that comes in stereotyping. And all of these examples are harmful because when you generalize a situation, it can lead to poor decision making. And lastly, but certainly not least, I just want to cover a little bit about ethnocentrism or ethnocentricity, which is how we internalize it, and how it relates to issues among criminal justice professionals and the way that we communicate with the public. So everybody at some point in time has ethnocentricity. So it's the way that you view your culture, the things that you find superior. In fact, actually, a quick story. The other day at our court building, there was a new lawyer, and he's from Nigeria. And when my coworker watched him on the phone, he was kind of dancing around. He has a lot of spunk to him. And my coworker said, "Oh, that's weird." And I said, "It's only weird because that's not how we behave in our culture. It's probably completely normal in his culture." So that's kind of gives you just a quick example of ethnocentrism. Now, ethnocentricity is an issue in the criminal justice culture because we perceive people who are different from our culture, people who are even part of our culture, but are part of a counterculture. So, for example, maybe someone who's goth or emo, and the way that they present themselves. Some people might find that weird or difficult and might not be able to effectively communicate with them. And that goes for a lot of different circumstances throughout different cultures. And there's actually some questioning out there in how does ethnocentrism or ethnocentricity in this impact defendants? Do defendants end up with longer sentences because of our implicit biases, which are our internal biases that come from our culture? Or is there issues with how we perceive people through ethnocentricity? Like, are we not going to communicate? Are we not going to take the time to question them as much because we perceive them as perhaps unintelligent because they don't speak English fluently? That's a big thing. Perhaps they're deaf, and we don't take the time to communicate with them because we think that they simply don't understand. So ethnocentricity is very dangerous in the criminal justice profession because getting it wrong can negatively impact someone's life forever. Or whether it be an explicit bias that you may have developed from an interaction with a certain ethnicity or race or gender. These are all things that everybody has experienced, but to what level do we let them impact our profession? So it's definitely something that we have to internalize, something that we have to practice, and something that we have to get right. So just to recap, because we've been through a lot today, we talked about some different examples of the types of miscommunications we can have. We've talked about a lot about ethnocentricity. We've talked about race and ethnicity and prejudice and discrimination, culture, counterculture. And I think what we can all take away from here is that we all need to slow down and take the time and make sure that we are communicating effectively with everybody, and that it is imperative we get it right, because getting it wrong can negatively impact someone's life. So thank you so much for being here today. And I hope you take this information, internalize it a little bit, even if it's just one thing, and you can apply it to your everyday life.